Kids, today Spiff and I are going to tell you about how we met our guest. This is Two on One, the internet's top sensation, where we look at very popular, wonderful things from the past and ask the question, where's God in this? And is it worthy of liking it?
And what does it have to teach the church and all of the things? And we get to talk to each other and our guests. Welcome to Two on One, friends. I am the Reverend Stephanie Kendall.
I am the Reverend Arthur Stewart, who's very aware right now, but I'll get over that because we are talking about How I Met Your Mother today with the Reverend Erin Dickey in just a moment. But before we get there, hey, Spiff, have I ever told you about the pineapple incident?
No.
Have I ever told you about the stole incident?
I don't think so.
Do you want to do a brief episode of How I Met Your Sponsor?
Sure.
All right, kids. The year was 2019, and we reached out to Jeff Lunro Designs and said, hey, would you be willing to be our sponsor? And Jeff Lunro said, that would be great. Jeff Lunro Designs for 17 years has been making ordinary time extraordinary through the creation and cultivation of handmade liturgical textiles, stoles, paraments, banners, altar accessories, chasubles, copes, miters, and even liturgically themed and denominationally aware face masks.
It is, Jeff has incredible stoles and as you said, everything out there. It is beautiful. It is lovely. It has customization options, which we all know that we love. And our very own deuces, our followers, the people that love and watch this show and we love and, engage with back. We love you all. You have your very own code. It is the best code that is out there. Jeff gives it just to our viewers. It is 2on115. 2 on 1 is all letters, 15, the number 15, tack that onto the end to remind yourself that you're getting 15% off this stole order. So 2on115, go all the way through checkout to put that on, and it's your entire stole order. So it's not just one stole or two stoles, it is for the trinity of stoles that every pastor, clergy person, and or whoever needs, all of it gets 15% off by using the code 2on115.
You may hear this offer and think, let's go to the mall today to get these stoles, but that's not something you can do because it's only available online at jeffwunro.com, jeffwunrow.com. Do note, JW, I love you. Not going to tell you who that's about.
And then I started singing, let's go to the mall today. Go to Jeff Wunrow today, but after the show.
After the show, most certainly. Thank you, Jeff, for being our sponsor. Okay, let's get into that. Let's do our flashback and welcome back to the show, Erin Dickey, who's joining us to talk How I Met Your Mother. Erin.
Hello.
Oh, you're in the study, but it's terrifying.
I really tried, but it didn't work. So let me figure out how to get rid of that.
Okay, for those listening online, Erin popped in the living room scene or on the set of How I Met Your Mother, which is today's topic. And she had to take it off because she's backlit is really what was happening.
But Erin, welcome to 2 on 1. We're so glad to have you with us today as we talk about both the beloved and problematic television series, How I Met Your Mother. A reminder to our listeners, we are a spoiler show.
And that this show has been out for quite some time. So, but that doesn't stop any of us from not having watched all of it, as we learned last week or 2 weeks ago with Fast and the Furious. But Erin, thank you so much for joining us again. Always a joy and a pleasure to see you, because we don't get to see each other as often as we used to, because the story of how I met Erin and Arthur is that I went to seminary and met Erin and became a youth pastor and colleagues with Arthur. These reminiscent stories. But Erin, one of the first things I found out about you was that I think you named your car after the show and things. And so when we were talking about the reboot, How I Met Your Father, and how we want to do a How I Met Your Mother episode, you were immediately in my head. And so I reached out. But tell our viewers a little bit about who you are, what are you still doing, or what are you doing, that's new, and what about How I Met Your Mother do you love, like, hate? I don't know, like, why this show?
Awesome. Thank you. Well, I'm Erin. It's so good to see you all again. I'm currently serving as the senior pastor at Riverside Avenue Christian in Jacksonville, Florida, and I've been there for a little bit over 5 years. How I Met Your Mother became my favorite TV show towards like the middle of college. I remember watching it with a lot of my disciple friends, and I had just gone through a really bad breakup, which is like a theme of my life, and this show just spoke to me. And so at that point, I think they were live on season 4 or 5. And so I binged all of it and then just became obsessed. And so at one point, when I had to get a new car, I named it Robin Sparkles. My dog I didn't name him, but when I found him on the rescue website, he was purple. And because he was purple, they named him Barney. And since my favorite show is How I Met Your Mother, I was like, clearly this is fate. So Barney was the true love of my life and probably the worst character on the show. And actually, I was going to say he's the reason we need safe sanctuary policies is because of Barney Stinson. Not Barney the Cocker Spaniel. He was fine. Actually, he was perfect. So the show just came to mean so much to me because I think kind of in the series of bad breakups of my life, I identified so much with Ted. And I had this longing that love and this life that I so desperately wanted was out there, and the journey to get there it was a long one. And then as a kid, like my favorite TV show was Full House. And so to have Bob Saget, who carried me through my childhood, now narrate me through my young adult years was just so formative. And so after his passing a couple weeks ago, I started binge watching How I Met Your Mother again. And so now I'm like halfway through season 3 again for probably the 90th time.
It's one of those shows. Spiff and I were talking in our intermediary time together about how Friends is really the show that elder millennials kind of clicked into. I bet you 10 to 1 we all watched the finale live or very near it. I came back. And Friends is a highly problematic show as well. And then How I Met Your Mother is something that millennials were all into. It was 2005 to 2014. I'm sorry, I shouldn't say highly problematic, as everything is highly problematic, right? Because everything is in real time and the world changes around it. But 2005 to 2014 is a big leap in a lot of ways, socially and culturally and politically, not just how millennials came of age. For those of you unaware of How I Met Your Mother, it follows Ted Mosby, a young architect living in New York City trying to find love. Throughout the 9 seasons, he is telling the story of how he met his kid's mother to his kids in the year 2030. Is that right? Ted has married friends named Marshall and Lily, a womanizing scumbag friend named Barney Stinson, and on again, off again flirtatious crush with a Canadian news reporter named Robin Scherbatsky. It tracks them over 9 years of ups and downs, ins and outs, and it then ends with how Ted met the mother.
Yeah. And I think Barney would be a lot more problematic had he not been played by Neil Patrick Harris. But I think all of us just love Neil Harris so much that we're just like, it's Neil, it's fine. It's fine. But if we were to isolate Neil Patrick Harris from Barney, I think my so much higher.
I think you named something for me and for lots of us in the space, is like the packaging in which we receive something is so important to how one receives it, because I think you're dead on with that. And the character on page of Barney, if you were to read the lines and the things that he does, are abhorrent. Like they're just terrible. Even if sometimes he says something that might be funny in the moment, like most of it is just like, ooh, especially as you look back on it. But Neil's wonderful. And it's one of those things where, we don't often see openly gay people playing straight people, right? Like that's like casting politics is a real thing. And so, I wonder, or I'm curious about how he got that role. I'm sure it's out there somewhere, but how that came to be, because he plays someone that we hate, and he is just truly someone that, he's America's sweetheart.
It's because of Harold and Kumar Go to White Castle, because that movie, he plays a sex-addicted weirdo in that movie, which completely killed Doogie Howser and ultimately showed his range. And really, there's a direct line between him having the greatest cameo in Harold and Kumar to How I Met Your Mother. I think this actually asks our first question theologically about the church and about God with Barney Stinson. What does it mean for someone who's beloved to do deplorable things? Or what is it? The church kind of exists in that tension between like, oh, I love the church, and also, oh my gosh, look at the church. How do we put lipstick on Barney Stinson? How do we make make the bad stories palatable, or how do we allow for the bad stories to not overwhelm the good ones?
Well, and I think one of the main facets of Barney that we really just clung to, and I think what gave us so much empathy for him, aside from the actor, is the story of his pursuit for his father.
Yeah.
And like just how beautifully done that entire story was. And so I think looking at it from like the church perspective is that there are redeemable factors, and like what is that nugget, that sliver of hope that we could find within the person and build on that? Because we see like in Barney's love for trying to figure out where he came from and who his family is, and then ultimately the love that he has for his own mother. And then here's the spoiler at the end of the series, his infant daughter. It's been out for 9 years. I mean, come on, maybe 10 years, something, long time. We gave a warning.
We're a spoiler show. It's okay.
But to see that like there is something to peel back and there's something redeeming and beautiful within him.
And perhaps that's it. We make room for and with one another to, I don't know, how do we make room for bad people? Or rather, how do we make room for people who do bad things? But yeah, we're patient, we're gracious, I don't know.
We believe God at work in them, because I think that why we continue on that journey with Barney and his, really terrible way he treats women and, even his friends and people, is because he does grow, and at the end, I think he's not perfect, but there is growth there. We see him, try things and fail at them. And like he gives a lot of permission to be terrible and be loved. And I think that often we hit that, like we delineate them, right? Like if you are just an awful person, you got to fix yourself before we can love you, which is Barney. We can love him for lots of different, for lots of different reasons and spaces. He has gifts. And yet we can also say, here is how we need to help you grow. I think where the church has the responsibility to reflect on spaces like that is Barney's friends don't actually like say, hey, you're womanizing people and it's terrible. Let's help you stop that, right? Like it's a show and it's not all about, for all of the interventions, the ongoing interventions that they do, not one of them is for Barney's sexism, which is like, come on now. But that's the church's job, right? The church is to say like, hey, we love you. Don't worry about all of this, but like what you're doing is harmful. So let us help you move from that space. We don't need to say you need to be perfect to join us, to be a part of this. God,
I forgot about that entirely. I love the interventions on that show. I love that they made a banner. I love that they take it seriously.
Well, and it's true. What I like about this show too is that there's traditions, right? Like there's ongoing jokes that I'm naming as tradition, in a way that like every year you get some, kind of ongoing theme of a joke. For whatever reason, there's lots of them. The intervention.
Yeah.
Slap bet. I love the slap bet, and I'm absolutely against physical violence, but like I love the slap bets. I love and those things to me punctuate time in the way that like the liturgical calendar does for us, as well as Ash Wednesday, as like as we're coming up on different holidays and things. I'm like, oh, these people are they're moving forward too. So are we. So hopefully is the church. And it takes all sorts of characters to come together to make these things happen. And for me, that is church at its best, is when we can recognize the individual gifts that make the whole more unique and gracious.
I'm glad you said the slap bet, because so Slapsgiving is my favorite episode. And like I can mark a show based on the episode that makes me cry. And like the turning point is, when did that show emotionally speak to me? And for me, it was Slapsgiving. And it was because like after Robin and Ted's breakup, that was their first event where they shared their inside joke again of the general and things like that. And so being able to see them move past the tension that they had and learn to find a new way of being is a lot of what the church is. We have to move past what we once were and find a new way of coexisting and a new way of being together. And it is painful and it is difficult, but there's also laughter in it. And so I think that's what the Slapsgiving episode just like hit on a different level the first time I saw that one. And it changed my perspective of the show from like, oh, this is funny and cute, to like, this is really deep. And like, this is hitting me very hard.
And it's funny because the play, I think it's the second slap where Lily's in an awful play and they have to sit through it, and Barney is so offended, just on every level. And I've been that. I've absolutely been that person. I'm terrible at weddings and funerals that I'm not officiating, and I've actually worked on this in sobriety. But Barney is so mad that, and this is when I identified with Barney, he puts on his own horrible one-man show to make his friends suffer as he suffered. And it's ended only when Marshall walks up and hits him so hard he spins and falls over. There's something to be said about the slaps where this was agreed upon, they are going to be used, it is going to hurt, and it's not forever.
Mhm.
And there's a fascinating thing in community because I won't say which person who's very important in my life, but a friend of mine, and here's your hint, that person has been a guest on this show, absolutely has punched me 3 times, all of which I've deserved and goaded that person into, and I would not define a relationship as violent, if that makes sense. Like there is that in community, there has to be the pushback, preferably without any sort of physical violence. I'm not promoting.
Sure.
If you're giving me a look like I'm crazy, I'm sorry.
I'm not. No, I'm not at all. I was just trying to listen, and relationships are complicated. One of the things that I really like, again, we're all talking about slapsgiving, and all of us, I think, would probably say, like, don't slap other people. Like, let's just not, right? But the rules are set, they are agreed upon, there is consent, and when the rules change, like they give a slap to someone else or someone gets to define terms, there is a call for consent of like how to move forward in a way that I think we as a church could really learn from. Like, hey, we're thinking of pivoting in this way, and not just the once a year annual meeting sort of a thing, but like, hey, there are new Bibles out. Hey, these songs that we sing are problematic. Hey, there's new things that we want to engage. What do you think? Can we consent to journey in this way together? And it takes leadership, which is why, you know, the commissioner, is that what they call her? Like
commissioner, yeah.
You know, like has an authoritative role in it.
And the slap bet commissioner is authorized by the participants in the slap bet. Are we?
Exactly.
I want to make sure we're clear about this. I want to make sure we're entirely clear. Are we suggesting the church can learn how to better understand consensus by saying that the slap bet in How I Met Your Mother exemplifies consensus and leadership?
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Consensus, but also consent.
Yeah.
That they're the active participants in the harm that you have named are engaging, because I don't want I have lots of problems saying, like, you know, any sort of physical violence or any sort of any violence at all in the church is okay. That's not what we are saying, but the structure in which the slap bet comes to fruition and understanding, the parameters, the transparency, the covenant, the clear, you know, and the consent helps lead to consensus of the group on how to move forward. And the church,
the slap bet is funny because it is on a television show.
Right.
We're not on a television show, we're on a podcast. Okay.
But yes, I think, you know, like, there are theological things to be heard and learned in all of these. God is still speaking in all of these spaces. And this, apparently the slap bet is one of them. Who knew? That is the reason we have this podcast.
So Erin, who's your favorite character on How I Met Your Mother of the big 5?
So I think I identified with Ted, but I longed for a Marshall. So I think Marshall probably is and I think now that I've like passed the stage of where Ted was and where I was when I started watching the show, I think Marshall is. And I think Marshall is, he's the family, wholesome, like, for the most part, he's like, Marshall is a dedicated, good person who makes killer puns. Like, he and I are kindred spirits. But I think that's also because that's who you strive to be. You look to the better character, and Ted has a lot of faults, and I see a lot of my same faults in Ted. And so, though my favorite, I think, is Marshall, I think I hands down identify with Ted the most.
Yeah, spot it, you got it type thing.
Yeah.
I both love and hate Barney Stinson.
Yeah.
I think I got Robin the most. I will admit I watched How I Met Your Mother at Bright, like in one of those like space, like so well after it had aired. In the same way that I watched Gilmore Girls, I was like, what other mid 2000s thing that I like just miss? Working in the industry, which is a weird thing to have done. And so I watched all of this and I was like, okay, like I get it. Like I get why people liked it. I get this. But I definitely, being a new person, you know, a person from California in Texas, like vegetarian, Democrat, very liberal person, being like, let's go to Texas to seminary. I very much felt like the, you know, teen Canadian pop star in New York trying to make it.
Well, and I will add that out of the main five, my favorite character, hands down, is Victoria. So I called that from season one, that Victoria was supposed to be the mother. And that's one of like those like hidden trivia things, is they had planned, if the show didn't get renewed past the first season, that she would end up being the mother. And so when she came back, and I think it was the end of 5 or 6, everyone was texting me. They were like, you called this 5 years ago. Like, and I was dancing in my room screaming because I was so happy to see Victoria back.
Well, so this brings up a really interesting point about the storytelling in How I Met Your Mother and the real-time engagement with fans, because arguably from 2005 to 2014, one of the biggest shifts was that online communities could develop and in real time compare notes and make declarations. Friends, which I guess we've brought up, that wasn't the case. People could respond, but they couldn't react.
Yeah.
And with How I Met Your Mother, the storytelling became, there's before Marshall's dad dies, there's apparently a countdown in like 35 episodes leading up to it. Do you know about this, Spiff?
And I think it's actually just that one episode. It's throughout that one episode, it counts with 30, and it's things from like the cab number to the table number to like,
okay, so it's that episode, and and literally they do that without ever calling attention to it. But then folks get to share on the meta story, right? Like, and how the finale was recorded with the kids when they were still kids because they couldn't do it 9 years later. And I have a lit candle over to my left, which I forget is there, and I just stuck my finger in the flame. But it's the storytelling shift. So then my question is for the church, right? A lot of churches are stuck in sage on the stage, let's do worship the way we did it in the 60s when it worked model. And there's some shift to it, but overall we keep the same structure and format and ideas. How I Met Your Mother re-engaged how they tell stories. What is it going to take, do you think, for congregations to be like, okay, let's innovate with what is familiar and with what is not?
You know, I think COVID kind of gave us that opportunity because it forced us to rethink. And like when for the churches that shifted to virtual only or virtual for a time being, and I know some have not gone back, some have gone back very cautiously, some never stopped meeting in person. And so I think for those that especially had to stop and be very critical of how their worship structure was functioning, how they engaged in worship, especially when they weren't in the same physical space, that kind of gave us permission to reimagine and re-envision what worked and what didn't work.
Yeah, and I like that. I mean, I think episodics teach the church something writ large anyways, in that something new happens they are different people because you know a different part of the story, so you know them in a different way. And I think that the church can really learn from taking that posture as well, that, you know, if you are someone who is like, let's say a greeter on Sunday, right, and you greet the same people every single week, to acknowledge that, you know, an entire week has passed since you last saw them. You know, maybe something has happened in the news, in the world, in their life, you know, and that we are living different episodes every time we meet each other. We know a little bit more of each other's story. We know a little bit more of where we hope we are going, or what their hope is where they are going. And I think so often we're like, kingdom, the end, right? Like that's the map we're all on, we're all going there. And it's like, no, there's benchmarks along the way for all of us that inform how we define the kingdom, how we engage it, how we think we need to get there, as we see through, you know, Ted's different girlfriends, right? We think, oh, here's the perfect, Robin's great for him. And then, oh, they break up and he's with other people. It's like, oh, okay, I get it. Victoria, other people. And it's like, oh, the person that we thought was best in his life, he doesn't think so. Here are all the ways in which things have happened and grown, and we have grown with them. And to acknowledge that, I think is a really helpful tool that we can learn from stories like this for the church writ large, and primarily church leadership. Especially, I don't know if y'all preached a couple of weeks ago that no prophet is accepted in his hometown, sort of a thing. And it's yeah, and it kind of speaks to that, right? That it's like, if we don't acknowledge the growth, the movement, you know, the different time periods in our stories, then we can't accept who you are as the person that God has made you to be in this moment, because we keep holding you back in season 1.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and I know Arthur said they're celebrating their 100th, or had just celebrated it. We just celebrated our 100th this year. And I think I noticed this when I was working on our church financial review, like the pretty version that says like, this is what we did, and like, this is the outreach we did and stuff like that, not the actual number part. That one of the spaces we always include is the looking ahead. And for the past few years, we've been building up to this 100, that when we got to the looking ahead, I just blanked. And I was like, I don't know what we're looking ahead to. Like, we've been looking ahead to the 100, and then we spent the last year reflecting back on 100 years and what is going to be new in the year to come, and what is going to be new in 5 years to come. And without it, we have to acknowledge the past, but we also can't let that negate what's going to happen in the future.
Okay, so this is just coming to me as you say that, because I think it's an interesting point for How I Met Your Mother. What changes in us when we arrive or get to the knowledge that we think we're seeking? When we learn who the mother is, what actually changes in our relationship to the whole story, in the way and I'm specifically curious, Erin, for you, in naming that, like, once you hit that 100-year milestone, what changed for you in in your understanding of the whole story? Is there a parallel in that you learned new or whatever?
I think in some ways, like when we look back on Ted, we're looking at all those clues. Like, I said I'm in the middle of season 3 again, which is probably my favorite season of the whole series. And we just watched the St. Patrick's Day episode, which Marshall does call Ted out on his very crappy behavior. And he says, the thing about like, your mother was there that night. And so we start, like, when we hear that, and then when we meet her seasons later, we start looking back of like, what were the glimpses of her? And so I think, like, when I look back at the history of the church, and I mean my congregation specifically, not the church all at large, though that would be good too. Like, I look for glimpses of myself, like, where was I present in this time? Even if I wasn't, obviously I was not born in 1921 when the church started, or if I was, I have a very good skincare routine. And so, like, looking back at how is the church prepared, or how's the church history prepared for me to take on this role, and what can I bring to the future? And a lot of times, like, we try not to separate ourselves from the congregation, or we try to think of like, we work within the body, and we do, but we also are called to lead in different ways. And we are in a space somewhat removed from them. Like, we're kind of like the Bob Saget of it. Like, we're narrating and sharing the story and giving a glimpse of it, and making space for those stories to change and adapt.
Well, and I like that. And I mean, one of the big controversies with How I Met Your Mother was the whole premise of the show was dancing around this person and the yellow umbrella. And is it Stella? Is it Victoria? Is it whomever else? And once Tracy was introduced, I want to talk about the finale if we could. Like, the very last shot is Ted meeting Tracy.
Mm-hmm. But
we also learned in the finale the mother died. And there's a clear division between people who either love the finale, and I am in that camp, because it was the story about how Ted loves Robin. That was the start of it, that was the end of it. And there's the camp that says the show's called How I Met Your Mother, not How I Got with Robin. And it can go both ways in that. I think what you're talking about with being part of the story is, I mean, what do we call the church today, serving 100-year-old congregations or 101-year-old congregations that have Riverside in their name, or 150? Spiff, how long has the park been around?
212.
Okay, so whatever, just brag.
I wasn't gonna drop it in earlier because I was like, I'm not.
Right. Okay, we only have 100 years. We together we don't have as much as the park. It is, though, what do we call what do we call the church? If it's How I Met Your Mother, but it really is how I lived my 20s and how I fell in love with Robin and how I did all these things.
I think
What-
it's how I became the church.
How I became the church.
Thoughts I had in the church, like there's been a lot of like, conversation of though, because the writers were critiqued so badly for the ending and them saying like, we liked the ending, and the actor is saying they liked the ending because that sometimes that's how life is. Like, it's not going to be the picture perfect ending, and we have to work within that. And so the story isn't just, I mean, it is How I Met Your Mother, and it's the events that are leading up to this pivotal moment, but that doesn't negate how pivotal those other moments were in it. And so one of the things I had thought about too was like, the show is kind of like a metaphor for the entire, like for all of scripture of, we talk about leading up to the resurrection and this pivotal point of the resurrection and meeting the mother, but that doesn't make the other stories any less important. And in fact, like those are critical parts of the story, and we don't understand the magnitude of meeting the mother or understanding the magnitude of the resurrection or celebrating 100 years or 212 years if we don't know those stories.
Well, that's a really fascinating way to put it, where the resurrection is the meeting the mother, but everything that came before informs it, everything that comes after informs it. If that's the pivotal, okay, I really like that, Erin.
It's really good. I was just thinking, I was like, oh, that's part of my final answer too now. Like, because I was like, yeah, ooh, I'm seeing the juxtaposition here. Yeah.
No.
No, and I'm curious about both of you, because we've all named that we've watched shows over and over again. Erin, this being one for you that you said you've seen like 90 times, and you're in a, like whatever that actual number is, maybe it is 90, maybe it's 200, who knows? And you're in the middle of it again. What still speaks to you, or how does watching those things, I guess, what is your process of maybe discernment of learning something new, letting yourself be open to seeing something different in it again and again in a way that I imagine all of us try and posture ourselves towards scripture, and why it's important that even if you've heard the story of the resurrection every single year, it's important to hear it again. I don't know, what do you get out of that consistency and coming back to it that may inform scripture for the rest of us?
Well, I think, you're at different points of your life when you watch it at different times. So when I started watching the show, I was 21 years old, and I just turned 33. There's a big difference between 21 and 33. And when I watch it again, it's like the trilogy episode where you have to rewatch the trilogy every 3 years. Like you're at a different point every time you watch it. And so you glean something new from it. And so in this particular run through, I'm not quite sure. I feel like whenever we get to the seasons where Marshall and Lily begin the children conversation, that's going to bring up something very different than it would have 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And so I think it's constantly seeking for how those things that brought us comfort can also kind of like bring us also resolution. Because in some ways it was like, this is what I looked forward to. And in other ways, it's the reminder of like, we have coped with this. Like we've gotten through this once before, we can get through it again.
When Ted bought his house out in the country, and it was the house, right? Or not out in the country, but in the city. I remember when I saw it, it was right after Colin and Nicole McCraney. We lived 80 steps away from each other for 2 years. And it was right after they were moving. And I did not handle that well. And I think about it now, where if I went back and watched it, I'd be like, yeah, of course you bought a house. Like that's a reasonable adult thing to do. Why would anybody want to move again? But I was so upset at that point. Good point. Well done. I don't know why I'm grading your points on this one, Erin, but I do want to ask about my favorite concept from the show, which is Robin Sparkles. Again, for the uninitiated, Robin Scherbatsky had a career as a 1980s pop singer, and in season 2 it's introduced that she was Robin Sparkles with her song Let's Go to the Mall. And it's friends in their 20s making fun of stuff you did as a teenager. And then there's a second one, Sandcastles in the Sand, right? And then there's the Beaver song on like the weird children's television show with Alan Thicke. But this comes back into the meta narrative with like They don't even bother introducing the fourth one. They have a cold open about something else, and Barney walks in, slaps down a DVD, and yells, "It's Robin Sparkles 4, y'all!" And everybody loses their mind. Begin opening credits. Where is surprise and joy? Where do you see it in the church today? Where do you see it in the context of congregations? Where do you see it in the bigger church? And that's a question for all three of us.
I shared this experience in a clergy group that I'm in yesterday, so I might be repeating myself for Spiff. But yesterday I had a 9-year-old who is relatively new to the church. Her grandmother's a longtime member, and then the 9-year-old and her family have just started attending in the last few months. And she stopped me before worship and says, "Do you know what I like about having a female pastor or a girl pastor?" And I said, "What?" And she goes, "It tells me I can be anything I want to be when I grow up." And I said, "That's so cool." And I was like, "You're so right. You can be anything. Like, what do you think you want to be?" And she said, "I don't know. I think I want to be a girl pastor maybe." And I said, "Well, you want to know something fun? There's a whole club of girl pastors that I'm a part of, and you could be a part of it too." And her face looked like it was going to explode with joy. And this is a child who I don't think she said more than 3 words to me before this point. But remembering that, like, what we do has an impact, and it may not necessarily be in the church, but now this child might see, like, oh, I could be the vice president, I could be the president, I could be an astronaut. And it started with those messages of inclusivity that they see from the church.
I could be a space teen.
I could be a Canadian pop star. Like,
We could all be Canadian pop stars. No, it's such a good message. It's an important one. Representation matters, which again, I mean, that's a side issue right there. Like, there's the lack of diversity in this character or in this show is glaring. It's a very bright show. But I love that, Erin. I love that, where do we find hope and joy? It's in those unexpected moments of connection and surprise, that even sometimes that surprise is us when we don't know it, right? Like, you were the surprise for that little girl, and she got to reciprocate that for you in that space. And how beautiful that is, that the joy and the surprise that comes with worship, that comes with an ever expanding God and a recreating God, is that not only do we get to be the miracle and get to be the surprise, but that it often gets reflected to us in the unexpected. And I think that is, if we stop being so rigid in spaces, or if we can allow some of that malleability, in our church writ large, I think that we can start to see that and be that miracle and surprise more authentically and more often.
I'm going to tell you guys my surprise because I loved it. And it was a moment that made me like, so a new person has been visiting the congregation, and she attended a meeting of a committee that I wasn't at, but she proceeded to text me an apology for being like crazy at the meeting. And I wrote her back without knowing who it was or what they were talking about with, "I'm sure you fall within the bell curve." Like, whatever, we're not going to worry about that kind of thing. However, she called with a major pastoral concern about someone she loved, and it was huge, and I had no idea what to do. And I said, "Okay, well, why don't we pray about it?" She goes, "That's a great idea." And she launched into one of the best prayers I've ever heard in my life. And I've never, ever, 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 ever had somebody, when I say, "Let's pray together," start praying. That's always been like, the implication is I'm going to pray, and it didn't happen. And it was just this beautiful moment where I was like, oh, this should happen more frequently. This is great. We get Robin Sparkles 4, y'all.
I love it. I new people. My favorite thing is when people come to our church and say, like, that they hadn't been to church in a really long time and they feel welcome. Like, I don't care where I am. If I hear that, any one of those stories, it makes it, I well up in that, like, this work matters, right? Because so often I think we get kind of out in the weeds with it. Is the newsletter good enough? Is the bulletin done? Are we on budget? All the things that are important. I'm not trying to like minimize them, but that the relational aspect of what it means to be in this moment together shouldn't catch me off guard as much as it does. And it does, and it is beautiful. And I'm grateful for those spaces. And then they're like, people are like, we want you to marry us, like you do same gender weddings. Like we couldn't get married in a church. Would you, do a ceremony for us here? Would you, like my wife and I could hold hands, or my husband and I could hold hands in your church and feel welcome, like, and know that, God is present in that moment. And I'm like, you kidding me? Yes. Like that's the work.
So I think that's a good question that comes up into it. So How I Met Your Mother is about relationship. I mean, that's ultimately the core of it. Good, bad, indifferent, ridiculous. And I was thinking about it when we talked about Marshall earlier, about how Marshall and Barney don't really like each other. They love each other, but they don't always like each other. And they're always seemingly at opposition, at least to later seasons, and how they made it a point that Tracy met the entire gang and built connection with them before she ever met Ted. And how is the point of How I Met Your Mother not how Ted Mosby met his kid's mother, but really instead how Ted Mosby became a person intertwined? And is that really the point of the church? I mean, is that arguably corporate worship? Yes. But I mean, is it just that simple of building relationship? Because that's what all of those stories are, right?
And I think about Ted, going through so many different relationships before he gets to the one. And even then still has another one, the one afterwards. Is that like those that are seeking the church and seeking to be in relationship with the church, as they try and they try and they try and continually get their heart broken? And what is the church are we doing to alleviate that heartache before they arrive? Because I think the three of us are in similar situations. By a lot of times, once folks get to our doors, they've been heartbroken by the church quite a bit. And it takes a lot of strength to try to fall in love again.
Oh, well, I didn't expect this episode to go this direction. I like it. I can also just say one of my favorite jokes of all time is in the Robin Sparkles episode, because they did behind the music and they're interviewing all sorts of folk. And at one point, they're interviewing Canadians, and there's Dave Coulier, who played Uncle Joey on Full House. And he says, "It's not about me. Why does everyone think it's about me?" Which was
a niche joke.
You ought to know. But then Bob Saget, as Ted Mosby, says, "I always found that guy really funny." Or like it's some line in that. And I'm like, they're just piling the meta on for 20 seconds. And it's throwaway humor is beautiful.
Well, and even that, I think, shows why relationship and like what TV does, like why we continue to do this podcast is because so many of us are watching the same thing or have watched, and it builds community in ways that then you learn and see things in new ways. Like if you didn't know any of that and you're just watching it by yourself, you miss all of those jokes. But if you are watching with someone that can tell you, oh, well, that's a joke about Alanis Morissette, who was a 90s kind of grunge pop star, which is, Robin Sparkles is more towards Tiffany, but that's a different thing, and here are all the jokes. And, being in community and in that relationship to say, like, here's what I see, what do you see in this moment? Is really powerful, and then allows you to understand the narrative even more.
So is the hullabaloo about the finale, the great division in it, a matter of if people feel betrayed or not?
I think so. Or like they invested so much just to like Ted have their heart broken. However, there's the caveat that back on these old fashioned things called DVDs, there's an alternate ending episode that you can watch where it just stops. Like she doesn't die. It doesn't go back to Robin. It just stops. And it ends with them saying, this is how, so like there is that option that you have to go seek out. But I think that's where it felt like I invested so much time and energy into this story, and it didn't go the way I wanted. So I'm going to leave. And I think there's something to be said about the church in that whenever people get mad and say, this didn't go the way I wanted, so I'm going to pack up my toys and leave. And I'm not going to be a part of this community anymore, even though they invested so much time in it. And I think even though I would have much rather have loved to have seen the happy ending of Ted and Tracy forever and them growing old together on the porch like they were supposed to, like that, I still love the show and I love the journey that the show was. So I'm not going to abandon it just because something happened that I didn't agree with.
Well, and I think that's yes. yes, that people pack up and leave super quickly. I think for finales writ large anyways, for a group of people, say the church, right, who believes in the resurrection, who talks so much about death, we do not do endings well. Not that we don't write them well, that we don't, I think the great division is that people just don't know how to process letting go. And that some things have a time frame, because in the spirit of resurrection, time is irrelevant, right? You get a resurrection. Even this show, we have How I Met Your Father now. There's even in this show we see resurrection, but we don't walk people well through finales of seasons, finales of series that stay final.
Well, and I don't know. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No. And I was just, as we were thinking about that, because every finale of every episode, people, I think 6 Feet Under is the only one that I think unanimously most people are like, that is a great, series finale. And it's, I agree. I think it's perfect. But people, Sopranos, just literally every episode that, or every series that ends, people, it polarizes people because loss is hard. And we don't talk about it in ways that say, yes, this ended, but what continues is that love, right? Because just because Tracy dies in the actual finale that the writers who created these people envisioned does not invalidate the years that Ted and Tracy spent together, the children and the home and the family and the friendships that they created together, even though it's not even the central part of what is being told here. I think I'm not going to use this as my final answer, but I think there's something to Tracy being a Jesus-like figure in which it's all about the gathering. It's the stories of before and the stories of after that really matter, and the connections that she makes in those times inform the one way or the other. And
there's life before Tracy and there's life after Tracy.
Yeah, and Tracy wants that, right? Tracy doesn't want her kids to stop living and her husband to stop love, like, I'm assuming, like, that's just part of family and faith and growth and being human. The world does not end when we do. And so, the world did not end when Jesus died. And, like, that there is resurrection for people of faith that believe in resurrection. This is, this teaches us that says we don't deal with death and dying well or often, even in a season where everyone seems to be death and dying, COVID, and then these series are ending and things, like, it doesn't matter how small the ending is, it's hard.
Well, and I don't know if y'all experience this, but when I'm rewatching shows like this, I don't watch the finale again. Like, it takes a lot of strength for me to rewatch the finale. And so, like, I'll make it to the second to last episode and then restart it because I don't want to process that ending again. And I don't mean the ending because I'm dissatisfied with it. I mean, like Jane the Virgin, I'll watch 99 episodes and I will not watch that 100th episode over and over. And I'll start back because you don't, when you love something so much, you just don't want it to end.
So that's fascinating because with the finale talk, I would say this: Parks and Rec had a perfect finale.
Yes,
like, absolutely.
Yeah,
perfect.
But I think part of it is it gives you the continuation
because it was open-ended.
And so that's what people like about 6 Feet Under. It's a continuation,
right? So all I'm hearing this is like, I don't think Revelation talks about the end. I think Revelation talks about Rome in like AD/CE. But when we talk about, there was one time at Disciples Crossing, and that beautiful thing person at a camp, and she was keynoting. She's a marvelous person. I don't think she listens to this. I was the chaplain because she was the keynoter, and she said, wow, this song you just sang is a preview of what it's going to be like in heaven when all we do for eternity is sing God's praises. And I said far too loudly, wow, that sounds boring. I think human beings need open-endedness. I think human beings need are they going to be okay, but are they going to keep going?
I think I was at that camp.
I think you were too.
I just think we need renewal, right? And like that, in this season, how do we find God for a season of renewal in these spaces? And that we hope, and because we hope that we're always renewed. We hope we are renewed for another day, another breath, another life. But like, we don't know what, there will be a finale. And I think it addresses our own mortality in a certain way. When we have to say goodbye, there's nothing new. It disrupts our understanding of like the day to day, right? Because maybe you have a routine of every Thursday night watching whatever it is, right? When SVU goes off the air and I have no more new SVUs on Thursday night, my Thursdays for like 21 years have been the exact same. I will have to do something new or fill it with something new. And while that may not be scary for me because it's a little minute, when we expand it into something much more real, relationship, community, things like that, it becomes harder to navigate, I think. And that's why the joy comes in, right? That's why we need the joy, because the joy brings the hope, the joy. You can endure the fact that Tracy dies at the end because you get a Slapsgiving episode, and you get, like all this silly humanness that comes with, that leads you to a finale.
And it's about the stories that make up the bigger story, not the bigger story itself.
Exactly.
I do want us to be cognizant of the time and aware of where we are going. We are approaching the very divisive finale of this episode. And we do have a final question, which Spiff asks marvelously.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you for coming. I don't know what it is, but we always go, like a little bit deeper, a little bit like on a different direction with like Goofy Movie and How I Met Your Mother than I think we had anticipated. But again, that's what good community, as we have here, and good storytelling, as or storytelling writ large, does. And so thank you for coming and sharing your journey and all that is happening in your life, and how I Met Your Mother has influenced you and your faith. I think it's really beautiful. So thank you. But what biblical theme, narrative, character, verse, etc. are you most influenced by, or are you most reminded of in How I Met Your Mother?
So I thought a lot about this, and I feel like this is one of those shows I know like the back of my hand. And it took me until like 5 a.m. this morning to figure out who it was. And for me, it's Hannah and 1 Samuel. And the way that Hannah finds herself in the church praying fervently for this child that she so desperately wants. And people ridicule her and they make fun of her and they intentionally like try to separate her and tell her that what she's doing is useless and wasteful and it will never happen. And that ends up not being the case. And she's given this child that she so fervently prays for. And I see that a lot in Ted. And Ted longed for this life that he imagined and he knew would one day happen. And even when his friends told him like he was wasting his time and he was ridiculous and this would never work for him, like he kept going on. And as you guys know, but your audience likely doesn't, I'm in that position now too, of after trying to have a child for so long, between my last appearance on this episode and this for Goofy Movie and this one, and that time in between had a little cancer diagnosis, wave goodbye to my uterus, and will never be able to have a child in that way. And so to identify with Hannah and still to seek that hope of knowing that's not the end of the road. And I know that's not the end of my road. Ted knows it's not the end of his road. And even when he got that defeating answer of Tracy's not going to live, like he still had a good ending, and not even an ending, he still had a continuation of the story. And so knowing that Hannah's able to continue her story, Ted's able to continue his story, and by God, my story will still be continued. Like so much of Ted and Hannah, and apparently now my cat. He was good the whole season until just now.
She's great, and she's always welcome. And Erin, I think you just did something that we hope continues to happen in both this space and in the church writ large, is that you are sharing a vulnerable story with us. And we're really grateful for you sharing and naming that. I don't think we talk about the hard things of what it means to be human as a whole, in our wholeness, particularly women in ministry, particularly when, whatever your particularity is. But I think fertility is a huge under discussed space, especially for clergy people and our churches writ large. And so thank you for bringing that and sharing with our community and in this space. we really appreciate it.
We'll get a Daisy and a Marvin eventually.
Absolutely. And I appreciate in you just naming your own hopes and joy and the places in which you feel, the season may have ended, but the series will continue and all of that. Again, like we say, these shows teach not only the church, but faith leaders and each of us who are just human, how to be in relationship, how to be human. So thank you for modeling that. Arthur, you want to take a stab at your final?
Yeah, I'm gonna say two characters are the different sides of the same. I'm gonna argue that Ranjit and Scooter are the Holy Spirit. Because Ranjit, if you read his rants that are in like Rabbit or Duck, when they're talking about it, he's arguing for Duck. In The Goat, he yells at Barney because he's acting dishonorably, and he's always there to convey, to transport, but also to challenge. And it's a space of growth, reflection, and consideration. And Scooter, played by Neil Patrick Harris's husband, I don't know if you knew that. Scooter just does not give up. Scooter is relentless, and there's always hope of reconciliation, and there's always hope of return, and there's always hope of more.
I like that. I'm gonna go with the ever cycling kind of relationships, primarily female relations that come in and out of Ted's life, especially just every episode as a new, even if it's just a woman that walks by, the question of, is that the mother is always present. I'm going to go with Cain and Abel's wives that come out of nowhere and clearly inform lots of parts of every story, for those that see that lineage as, a faithful part of our journey in the scriptures. But those women come out of absolutely nowhere, like just here they are. And I think so often that we saw that happening for Ted and Ted's relationships, that they just kind of seem to come out of nowhere and then they are meaningful and all of that. But that also we all have those people that to be on the lookout, that the people that come out of nowhere can have great and impactful meaning on our lives.
Okay, this has been this has definitely been an episode of the 2-on-1 Project. We'd love to hear from y'all. I don't think we make that invitation, but to our listeners, to our viewers, to our deuces, where do you see something biblical with what we've talked about today? Is Gary Blauman in fact the devil? Let us know in the comments, or let us know via email at twoononeproject@gmail.com.
This is just a reminder that we are sponsored by Jeff Wenrow Designs.
Oh my gosh.
You can head on over to Jeff Wenrow. You can head to the 2-on-1 or twoononeproject.com. Has every episode. If you have missed any of our episodes, like and subscribe to all of the channels and everything, but also click on that sponsor link. It'll give you everything you need to know about how to connect with Jeff Wenrow. Use your 2-on-1 discount, which is 15% off your entire store order.
If you ever share fries with Jeff Wenrow and he has 4 of them, they will just be regular fries. He won't eat your lucky curly fry. That's a deep cut for y'all. But go to jeffwenrow.com, use our promo code, make things happen, watch our episodes, come back again. On behalf of the 2-on-1 Project, I am the Reverend Arthur Stewart.
I'm the Reverend Stephanie Kendall.
And I'm Reverend Erin Dickey.
Hey, and we're glad to have you with us today, Erin, and we will be back for another episode soon. Get more 2-on-1 at twoononeproject.com.